Okay, here we go. Prologue. The year was 1866, and the girl whose first step was a hop, Omachaius, sometimes skipped as she chased after her children. Omachaius and her husband, Anamikines, had moved away from villages on the shores of Lake of the Woods. They wanted to escape the illnesses that the fur traders brought along with bright cloth and wonderful tools. Omachaius, Anamikines, and their family lived in a remote land that gave them everything they needed: birch bark for making houses, animals and plants for food, wood for warmth, and cold, sparkling water to dip and drink from the lake. This year, however, a most precious being would be stolen from them. They would follow. Only an act so shocking would bring them away from all they knew onto the Great Plains. There they would learn how to survive in a landscape of harsh charms and brutal winds. They would learn the ways of the horse, the ox cart, and their new neighbors, the Métis. They would build their life anew and change forever. Chapter 1. The Hunting Spirit. Chickadee was sure that he remembered everything about the day that he and his twin brother were born. "It was cold, wasn't it, Mama? Just like today? Didn't the snow come quickly? I remember that there was a lot of snow." Omachaius looked down at him and smiled wearily. She had told him the story 100 times, and Chickadee had told it 100 times more. He had heard it so many times that he now believed that he was the one who remembered every detail. He was an exhausting child, and there were two of them. His twin, Macuns, was using a stick to spear an imaginary bear like the old woman in his mother's stories. "I'm old Tallow," he cried. "Stand still, Mama. You be the bear." Omachaius growled and took the stick. The twins were 8 years old, and Omachaius was alone in the camp with them. Their father, Anamikines, was out hunting moose. Ordinarily, he would have taken the boys along so they could learn to hunt by his side. But today, the air had taken on that iron edge of snow. The sky was growing dark and the clouds looked heavy. Snow for certain. Perhaps that was why Chickadee could not stop talking about the day he was born. "I remember," he started again. "You were out collecting wood. I was cold." "We were cold," Macuns corrected. "You were out collecting wood for a big fire, Mama, when suddenly the snow just whirled around, down out of nowhere. It was a flash storm, a blizzard. You started back to the lodge. You staggered, carrying your load of wood." Chickadee pitched forward, and Macuns pretended he was a heavy wind and tried to push his brother over. Omachaius sighed again and picked through some manumine, wild rice, for stray stones and husks. She was boiling the last of their meat over a small fire and hoping the Anamikines would have luck out on the trail of a moose. She was humming a hunting song under her breath to help him. Chickadee tugged on her heavy blue wool dress. "You staggered into camp. You barely made it. You crawled into the lodge and got close to the fire. You threw down the firewood and opened your blanket and—" "Aye," said Omachaius. "There I was," said Chickadee with great satisfaction. "I had come to help you. I had flown into your blanket." "The snow was so thick in the air that the little Chickadee must have knocked right into me and nestled close," said Omachaius. She was always drawn into the story in spite of herself. "It was Iskigamizigi Gizis, the moon of maple sap, where we always get together to make maple sugar. There you were, in the sugaring camp. The Chickadee had got whirled around in the snow just like you." "And we came early too," said Macuns. "We surprised you. We were very tiny. Each of us fit in a small macaque, a little bowl. Our father could hold each of us in the palm of his hand." "Aya," said Omachaius, remembering what her grandmother Nokomis had said about how the world was created by twin brothers. As she had looked at the tiny babies that day, she wondered, could they have been as small and helpless as these ones? "The Chickadee stayed with you the whole time we were getting born. That's why you named me for him, right?" Omachaius thought of how the Chickadee, unafraid, had perched near her the entire time. She smiled and nodded. "And it was that time when little bears are born. They were waking in their dens. It was a late snowstorm," said Macuns, whose name meant little bear. "And nobody thought we would survive," both twins said with satisfaction. "Everybody said we would die." Omachaius tried to hide the tears in her eyes. "But you had strong guardian spirits," she said, remembering too. "The Chickadee, the bear, both there in the snow. They stayed near and helped us all." At that moment, the twins' father, Anamikines, could have used some help. He had tracked a moose deep into a low mashgig, a wet marshland, and with every step his feet sank deep in freezing, mushy grass. His feet were past pain and growing numb. But like all Anishinabeg, he knew exactly where the line was between numbness that could awaken painfully and a bitter, frozen numbness that meant the destruction of a foot or a finger. He still had far to go, he thought, and took one careful step after another on the precarious ice. The moose was a large, suspicious male with a heavy rack of antlers. It paused whenever Anamikins moved, ready to bolt, knowing that something was not quite right. The two moved farther out onto the spring-melted ice. The man and the moose stood motionless for what seemed an eternity to the man, but didn't bother the moose one bit. Then all of a sudden, the moose gave a moose shrug and relaxed its guard. At that moment, Anamikin slowly raised his gun, fired, and in taking a step forward, plunged into icy waters up to his armpits. The moose turned, saw the man go down. Its eyes went red, its expression turned brutal as pain shot through its body, and it charged toward the man, trying desperately to scramble back onto solid ice. Back at home, the twins were still pestering their mother. "Show us how you kept the blankets warm with rocks," said Makun, "so we wouldn't die." "I've shown you that 100 times," said Omakayas. "Your father helped. He kept the flat stones from getting too hot. He kept the stones to exactly the right temperature. Then we put your little sleeping Makakun on top of the rocks so you would stay warm. But mostly, I just carried you everywhere. You were so tiny I could hardly feel your weight." "Now look at us," said Chickadee. "We are warriors." "Warriors," laughed Omakayas. She smiled at her thin little boys, whose spirit was so much larger than his body. "Yes, great warriors," she said. "So, how about checking my rabbit snares? How about doing a little hunting, too? And where is your father?" Anamikins was trying to scrabble back onto frail ice. He raked at it with his frozen hands. He'd thrown off his mitts. He'd kicked up once and fell back. The moose scrambled up the shore and ran off. At least now, if he made it out of the freezing water, he wouldn't be stomped to death. Anamikins kicked himself upward again, but slid backward, off the ice again, and cried out for help. The cry was loud from the depth of his being. A hunting song came floating into his mind. He heard his love, his wife, Omakayas, singing. Her song gave him heart, but still he could feel a numb weakness spreading through him. What would his family do without him? He cried out once more. Then he saw something strange. Anamikins saw his father standing on the shore. But that could not be. His father had died 8 years ago. His father had always dressed in poor and ragged clothing, but now he wore a new blanket. The blanket was not of this world. It was covered in strokes of pale lightning. His father's head was covered with a beautiful woven turban. An eagle feather floated from the side. Oh, how kindly his eyes shone down. "Dede!" cried Anamikins. He knew at that moment that his father had come to bring him to the spirit world. We're going! The boys laughed as Omakaya shooed them out the door. They ran into the woods with their small, strong bows and their quivers of arrows. During the winter, the fat partridges, Biniwag, liked to roost on low tree branches. Chickadee knew that his mother would smile with pride if he shot a bine from a tree branch. Zosie, who lived with them and was like his big sister, would happily pluck and roast it. She would tell him what a little man he was and stir some of the last maple sugar into the strengthening cedar tea that she would make for him. "Busy Nidan," said Macoons. He stopped and looked around. "What?" asked Chickadee. "I thought I heard father call," said Macoons. "I don't hear anything," said Chickadee. "Nashke." He pointed up at a tree where a fat and fluffy bine sat blinking its mild eyes. The boys crept to the exact right place to shoot. They silently fit their stone-tipped bird arrows to their bows. They both shot at once, but neither hit the bird. The bine just watched the arrows fly by. It turned its head a little and ruffled its feathers. Again, the boys brought up their bows. Again, they shot, and again, they missed. The bine looked bored and shut its eyes for a nap. Each of them had only 2 arrows, and now they had to go and find them in order to shoot at the bird again. They were certain to scare the bine off, they thought. Knowing that they'd lost their chance, they walked boldly to the tree and thrashed around to find the arrows. To their surprise, the bird did not move. "Maybe it knows how hungry we are," said Chickadee. "Maybe it knows our namesakes are helping us," said Macoons, "although my little bear cubs are still sleeping this winter." "Maybe our grandfathers are helping us from a distance," Chickadee said. Again, they stood close to the perching bird, who looked even juicier now than before. Again, they fit their arrows to their bows. Chapter 2, Gawin Mashi. As his father smiled, Anamikins felt joy at seeing him, but also despair. Day, he cried, gripping the ice, weakening. I am not ready to die. Gawin Mashi, not yet. His father looked at him with steady eyes. Anamikins thought he was going to tell him, gently, to come along, just as he had when he was a boy. His father would tell him to come along to a place that frightened him, and he would join his father in the spirit world. But Anamikins did not want to go. I must go back, he cried. Father, I cannot join you. At last his father lowered his head and nodded. Then he pointed at a place on the ice just to the left of Anamikins. Suddenly, Anamikins saw that a branch had lodged there in the ice, a little beyond his grasp. But if he just kicked a little harder, strained a bit more, he might reach it. There! With an effort he didn't think he was capable of, Anamikins pulled himself forward. Then he crawled and wiggled carefully across the thin ice onto the shore and stood. Where his father had been, there was only empty snow. No tracks. Nothing. Quickly, with numb hands, but with an expert's knowledge that he had practiced since he was a child, Anamikins gathered dry birch shavings, moss, and bits of twig. He had no feelings in his hand now, but he told himself what to do, how to hold the striker, the steel, how to cup the spark, and steadily breathe an ember to life in a tiny nest of kindling. In no time, Anamikins had a fire going in the spot where his father had just appeared to him. He dried out his mitts, which had been strung inside his jacket. He winced as the blood entered his fingers and his toes. They'd throb and ache for days after this, but he was alive. Miigwech, Indede, he said. Miigwech for your love. Thank you for giving me this good life. Twice more, the twins shot and missed the bine, and yet it still waited in the tree. The bird's patience was beginning to spook the boys. Do you think it is a spirit bird? Asked Chickadee. Maybe it just wants us to eat, said Macoons. With a gasp, he released his arrow, and the bird fell from the tree. Wait, said Chickadee. Your arrow didn't hit the bine. I saw your arrow hit the tree. This is definitely a ghost bird, and I don't want to go near it. Ah, the great warriors, laughed a girl behind them. Zozie! She had 2 more rocks in her hand. It was Zozie who had brought the bird down into the snow. Did you check the snares? The twins shook their heads, and she smiled down at them. Zozie was tall and pretty. They were bashful and a bit in love with her. She was the daughter of their mother's powerful, enigmatic, bold, and sometimes bloodthirsty cousin, Two Strike. Zozie loved her mother, but as Two Strike readily admitted, her heart really wasn't in mothering. Two Strike loved to hunt and was far off to the north on a trap line. Zozie was happy to stay with Omokaius, who loved her and called her daughter. Waboos, she cried now, catching sight of a trapped rabbit. They knelt near a snare and removed the frozen rabbit. There was another rabbit caught in a snare set farther on. That one had already been half eaten by a weasel. Drax, said Chickadee. We just missed the weasel. I would have shot it. No, I would have shot it, said Macoons. Just like you shot the partridge, asked Zozie. The twins scuffled their feet in the snow, looked down, and didn't answer. After he felt the chill leave his heart, and after he got used to the fact that he would live, Anamikins remembered that his family was very hungry. His empty-handed return would disappoint them. Oh, they would cry when he told them about seeing his father. Omokaius would hold his hands to her face. The boys would cling to him. Zozie would hang her head and sigh. But they would all be even hungrier than they had been when he'd left. As a hunter, that made him very angry. Anamikins jumped to his feet. Where had that moose gone, that moose that drove him into the lake and nearly cost him his life? It had surged up the shore just past the spot where Anamikins' father had appeared. It had not looked back, but melted away into a heavy stand of spruce. Anamikins followed. All of a sudden, he stopped. A splash of dark blood lit the snow, then another, and another. A bit farther on, he saw the dark mound of the moose. Anamikins looked into the sky and smiled. He thanked his father just as the first flakes, and more flakes, and then a thin cloth, and then at last a heavy blanket of snow began to fall, and fall, and fall. Chapter 3 is entitled Reunion, and this will be our last chapter for this video. How much time do we have on this? Let's see. 15 minutes, that's about right. Chapter 3, Reunion. Zozie breathed the deeply cold air and smelled snow coming. Gigaweda, she said, let's go home. The boys trudged behind her, each carrying a rabbit. She had the partridge. Omakayas would be very, very glad to see them. On the way back, Zosie sang a little traveling song, and the boys sang too. Each beat of the song was a footstep, and even when the snow began to fall, they marched along cheerfully. They were sure that their father would make it home before them, and that if he'd had no luck, he would be filled with praise for their skills. By the time they reached the camp, the snow was swirling through the air. The wind was blowing hard and groaning in the trees. They could hardly see their birch bark house, their wiggy-wassy wigamig, but they heard the dog barking. A crack of warm light shone through the blanket slung over the entry, and Omakayas parted the door and came outside. "Is Day back yet?" "Gawin Mashi," said Omakayas. "Look at what we brought! What great hunters we are!" The twins gave their rabbits excitedly to Omakayas, forgetting that she was the one who had set the snares. "Hoa! And this plump Bine too. Did my little men hunt this bird?" Omakayas smiled at her twins, who looked up at Zosie. "We tried," said Chickadee. "Zosie knocked it down with a rock," said Macoons. Omakayas laughed and brushed the snow from Zosie's hair. "Her mama was always a deadly aim with a rock, too." Omakayas was remembering the sting of Two Strikes' pebbles when her cousin was angry, but that was a long time ago. Zosie smiled but looked around anxiously and said, "My uncle is not back." "He can take good care of himself," said Omakayas. But everyone noticed that when Omakayas made the stew that night and dished it out, she put a little macaque out for the spirits and a full bowl on the mat with the other food. That bowl was for Anamikins. No one touched it, but they all watched the bowl as the steam rose from the delicious meat and then slowly cooled. The snow came down so suddenly that Anamikins knew that he was trapped. He was far from the camp. He didn't dare walk so far in a disorienting blizzard, even to bring meat to his family. No, he had to camp where he was, and he'd better seek shelter fast. Luckily, he was in heavy spruce, and spruce branches could be made into a lean-to. He broke off an armload of boughs, took a hatchet to some larger branches, and quickly built himself a lean-to. He set it against a great rock, only a few feet from the place where the moose had died. With the snow falling thickly, there was no possibility of building a fire. Anamikins heaped snow into a circle high as he could. The snow was good insulation. He would sleep on a bed of boughs with thicker boughs to cover himself. At last, just before he nestled into a shelter as windtight as he could make it, Anamikins drew his knife and sliced out the moose's tongue and liver. He brought both into the shelter, heaped snow against the opening, and ate a bloody, raw, satisfying meal before he dozed off to sleep. 1 day, 2 days, 3 days of snow. The first night, the little family ate half the pot of stew. The second night, they ate the rest of the kettle and scraped the bottom with a knife. The third night, with great misgivings, they divided and ate the bowl of stew that had been sitting by the fire for Anamikins. Then they fell asleep. It wasn't much, and their insides gnawed. Halfway through the night, Omakayas woke, restless. Outside, the snow drove down, and the wind still growled and shook the branches of the trees. The snow was heaping higher and higher around the entrance of the wigwam. The dog, who had chewed up and devoured the already gnawed bones of the rabbits, was curled at the door with his tail over his head. It was still snowing, but Omakayas thought she heard something, someone. She shivered as a trickle of fear went up her back. Sometimes when the trees cracked and the snow came down hard, the spirit of winter, Bibunang, was out walking. It was a harsh spirit, and Omakayas didn't want to challenge it. She crept from her blankets and built up the fire. They would have to find some food tomorrow. The day dawned bright. The snow was finished. Although the air was hard and cold, the twins were elated to walk out on top of the drifts. There was no knowing where Anamikins had gone to, but Omakayas decided to set out for him anyway. She put on her snowshoes, took the dog with her, and told the twins and Zosie to set new snares and to gather balsam and melt snow for hot tea when she got home. She pulled a toboggan behind her and had a keen hatchet in her belt, which was lucky, for she hadn't been walking half an hour when Anamikins hailed her. "Anin!" she yelled with happiness. They hurled themselves together and held close. They had known each other since they were children, and they treasured each other very deeply. They swore that they had known they would be married ever since Omakayas had given food to the hungry boy who would become her husband. Anamikins had glared at her, starving on that day so long ago, but her gift of food had eventually melted his glare and his heart too. Now Omakayas rejoiced. They had real food. A moose would last them the rest of the winter. Piece by piece, the family hauled back the moose using the toboggan. Everyone also carried chunks of frozen meat with carrying straps. By the time they cached the meat near the camp, hoisting some into the tree, burying some in snow, they were warm and excited. Omakayas brought in the tenderest pieces of meat and began to make a feast. The rest of the family had been hunting in the next bay. Now they gathered. Mikwam Ice was Omakayas' father. She called him Dede. Yellow Kettle was her mother, but nobody called her grandmother yet because Nokome's grandmother was still alive and strong. Old as she was, Nokomis kept up with Mikwam and joked that when she smelled the meat roasting, she'd come running and leave him behind on the trail. There was Omakayas' beautiful sister, Angeline, and her husband, Fishtail. Angeline had survived a terrible illness, smallpox. She had no children, and this made her sad, except when Zosie came to live with her. Zosie called 3 different women Nimama, and nobody thought that strange. The whole family gathered that night. The wigwam was crowded and noisy, and everyone ate and told stories late into the night. Chickadee and Macoons curled together under one fluffy rabbit-skin blanket. Warm and full, lulled by the grown-ups' voices, they fell into a charmed sleep and dreamed, as they always did, together. Thanks for listening, and I will be back later this week with the next installment. Once again, don't forget to stop by our Google Classroom. I'll post a link in this video below. Have a great afternoon.